Welcome to this journey through one of the most literally life-threatening mysteries ever to descend upon the Ozark Plateau. In the years when fire was not comfort, but survival, when maintaining flame through winter months was the single most critical task that determined whether families lived or froze, when every cabin's hearth represented the thin barrier between warmth and death, there came a season when fire itself failed. Comment where you're watching from as we trace the coldest night the Ozarks ever knew. This video is a work of fiction, created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we approach that night when the fires died, consider what fire meant to frontier existence during winter. It was not simply a source of light or warmth, or a means of cooking food, though it was all of those things. Fire was the technology upon which survival absolutely depended. Without it, winter in the Ozarks, which could bring temperatures well below freezing for extended periods, was unsurvivable in the uninsulated log cabins that most settlers occupied. Fire was the difference between life and death, and its maintenance was treated with a seriousness that modern people who live in homes heated by systems that require no constant attention can barely comprehend. Every frontier household maintained fire constantly through winter months, banking coals at night to ensure that flame could be quickly restored in the morning, never allowing the hearth to go completely cold, because relighting from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. The loss of fire was a household emergency that required immediate attention and assistance from neighbors if necessary. To lose fire during a severe cold spell was to face death within hours, particularly for the young, the old, and the infirm, who could not generate sufficient body heat to survive prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures. The year 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War, though that conflict had not yet significantly touched the remote highlands of the Ozark Plateau, where our story unfolds. The region's concerns were more immediate than distant battles. Preparing for winter, ensuring adequate food stores, gathering the massive quantities of firewood that months of cold would require. The settlement along Richland Creek consisted of perhaps 25 families, scattered across several miles of Creek Valley and adjacent ridges, connected by trails and by the bonds of mutual aid that frontier survival demanded. Winter came early that year, with the first substantial freeze occurring in mid-November and with snow following within days. The cold was notable from the start, temperatures dropping to levels that even experienced settlers found remarkable for so early in the season. But the community was prepared. Cabins had been winterized. Firewood had been stacked in quantities that would last through the coldest months, and livestock had been secured in barns with sufficient feed to sustain them until spring. The fires were lit in every household, and they burned as they always did through November and into December, providing the warmth that made indoor life possible during the increasingly bitter cold. Families maintained their fires with the careful attention that winter required, adding wood at appropriate intervals, banking coals at night, ensuring that flame never failed. This was routine work, the fundamental task of winter survival, performed without particular thought because it was so thoroughly ingrained in frontier practice. On the night of December 17th, 1861, the temperature dropped more severely than it had yet that season. Clear skies and still air created conditions that allowed heat to radiate away from the Earth's surface without the moderating influence of cloud cover or wind-driven mixing of atmospheric layers. By the time families were preparing for sleep, the temperature had fallen to what settlers estimated was 15 or 20 degrees below zero. Cold enough that exposed skin would freeze within minutes, cold enough that inadequately sheltered livestock would die, cold enough that maintaining cabin warmth required fires burning at full intensity throughout the night. Every family banked their fires carefully that evening, adding sufficient wood to maintain coals through the night hours and to allow quick restoration of full flame in the morning. This was standard winter practice, performed with particular attention on very cold nights when fire failure would be especially dangerous. Men checked their hearths before bed, ensured that wood was stacked within easy reach, and went to sleep with the confidence that came from years of successful fire management through countless winter nights. At some point in the early morning hours, estimates varied, but most people placed it between 3 and 4 o'clock. Every fire in the settlement went out simultaneously, not gradually, not through the normal process of wood being consumed and coals dying when not replenished. The fires simply extinguished all at once across every household in the settlement, despite being carefully tended and despite containing sufficient fuel to burn for hours more. One moment there were fires burning in 25 hearths across several miles of Creek Valley. The next moment, there were none. The realization of what had happened came slowly, because families were asleep, because the initial cooling of cabins was gradual enough not to immediately wake people, and because each household assumed initially that only their own fire had failed through some local error in banking or some problem with their specific hearth. But as people woke to cold cabins and discovered dead hearths, and as they attempted to understand what had happened, a pattern emerged that was impossible to attribute to coincidence or to normal fire failure. Every single fire had gone out at the same time. Not one hearth in the entire settlement had maintained its flame. Not one family had successfully kept their fire burning through the night. The simultaneous failure across such a wide area, affecting fires that had been properly maintained and adequately fueled, defied every principle of how fire functioned and how it was managed. The immediate concern was not understanding what had caused the simultaneous extinction, but rather restoring fire before the cold became lethal. Cabins were already approaching freezing temperature inside. Without fire, the poorly insulated log structures offered minimal protection from the extreme outside cold. Children and elderly were at immediate risk, and even healthy adults would face hypothermia within hours if warmth could not be restored. The normal process for relighting a fire involved taking coals or embers from the existing hearth and using them to ignite fresh kindling and wood. But with no fires burning anywhere in the settlement, there were no coals to work from. Every household would need to create fire from scratch, using flint and steel or other friction methods to generate the initial spark that would ignite tinder and eventually allow fire building. This process, while possible, was time-consuming and not always reliable. Frontier families kept the equipment necessary for fire starting, but most had not needed to use it in years because they maintained continuous fire through banking, rather than allowing complete extinction. The techniques required practice, the materials needed to be very dry, and success was not guaranteed on the first or even the 10th attempt. As families across the settlement began attempting to restart their fires using whatever methods and materials they had available, they encountered a problem that transformed their situation from difficult to terrifying. The fires would not light. Sparks could be generated. Tinder could be made to smolder. The initial stages of fire creation proceeded normally. But when the smoldering tinder was introduced to kindling, when the process should have progressed from ember to small flame to self-sustaining fire, it failed. The kindling would not catch. The small flames that occasionally appeared would flicker and die within seconds. Fire would not establish itself, would not grow, would not become the sustained combustion that was needed. This was impossible. Fire was chemistry, was physics, was the inevitable result of combining fuel, heat, and oxygen in appropriate proportions. If those elements were present, fire occurred. It was not something that could simply fail to work. Yet across the settlement, in cabin after cabin, people were discovering that it was failing. The materials were right, the techniques were correct, the conditions should have been sufficient, but fire would not sustain itself. The temperature inside cabins continued to drop as the morning hours passed without successful fire restoration. People bundled in all available clothing and blankets, huddled together for shared body heat, and grew increasingly desperate as repeated attempts to create fire continued to fail. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was genuinely life-threatening, particularly for the very young and very old, who lacked the metabolic capacity to maintain body temperature in such extreme conditions. By mid-morning, with no fires successfully lit, and with cabin temperatures approaching the outside temperature of well below zero, families began to consider whether they should abandon their cabins and seek shelter together, pooling body heat in one location and sharing whatever warming strategies anyone could devise. But this meant exposure to the outside cold during travel, which carried its own risks, and the central gathering place would be just as cold as individual cabins, without fire to warm it. It was, at this point, perhaps 9 o'clock in the morning, approximately 6 hours after the fires had gone out, that someone discovered that fire could be created outside the cabins. A man named Samuel Morrison, attempting to start a fire in his dooryard in hopes that external conditions might somehow be more favorable than internal ones, succeeded in getting kindling to catch and burn. The fire established itself normally, grew when fed additional wood, and functioned exactly as fire should. This discovery was immediately shared, and within an hour, multiple families had established outdoor fires. The fires burned normally, provided heat, and could be maintained through standard fire-tending practices. But they would not burn indoors. Wood that would combust readily in the open air would not sustain flame when brought inside a cabin. Coals that burned brightly in outdoor fires would die within seconds of being carried through a doorway. The community gathered around the outdoor fires, seeking what warmth they could while trying to understand what was preventing indoor combustion. Various theories were proposed and tested. Perhaps the cabins themselves were somehow interfering with fire, the wood they were built from, the materials used for chinking, something in their construction. But tests with fires built in cleared areas indoors, away from walls and structures, failed just as fires built in hearths did. Perhaps the problem was related to air supply. Cabins were relatively tight, and perhaps something about the indoor air was preventing proper combustion. But opening doors and windows to provide abundant fresh air made no difference. Fire still would not sustain itself indoors. Perhaps the hearths themselves were the problem, but fires built on bare earth floors inside cabins failed just as those built in stone hearths did. The location inside a structure, rather than any specific feature of that structure, appeared to be what prevented fire from establishing. This meant that the community faced a terrible choice. They could remain outside, gathered around fires that provided some warmth, but that left them exposed to wind, to the extreme cold that persisted despite bright sunlight. Or they could retreat to the limited protection of their cabins, but without fire, those cabins offered only minimal advantage over being fully exposed outside. The solution they developed, out of desperate necessity, was to construct temporary shelters around the outdoor fires, windbreaks and lean-tos that provided some protection from wind while keeping fires technically outside and therefore functional. Families moved bedding and supplies close to these sheltered fire sites and prepared to maintain the fires constantly while living in conditions far more primitive than their cabins would have provided. This arrangement was barely adequate. The fires provided some warmth, but the heating was uneven and insufficient in such extreme cold. People stayed warm enough to survive on the side facing the fire, while their backs remained exposed to freezing wind. Children cried from the cold, elderly suffered, and everyone understood that if the cold persisted and deepened, the temporary shelters would not be sufficient to prevent deaths from exposure. The situation continued through the day and into the second night. The fires burned outside, families huddled around them, and attempts to bring fire indoors continued to fail. The temperature remained brutally cold. Stars blazed in clear skies that promised continued extreme temperatures, and the community faced the reality that they might have to maintain this barely sustainable arrangement for days or weeks if the condition preventing indoor fire persisted. On the morning of the second day, December 18th, approximately 30 hours after the fires had first gone out, something changed. A family attempting to carry coals from an outdoor fire into their cabin for yet another relighting attempt found that the coals did not immediately die when brought inside. Encouraged, they added kindling, and the kindling caught. They added small wood, and the wood burned. Within minutes, they had a fire burning in their hearth, sustained and growing, functioning normally. Word spread quickly, and other families rushed to attempt relighting their own hearth fires. All succeeded. The indoor fire prohibition, whatever had caused it, had ended as suddenly and completely as it had begun. Within an hour, every household had restored their fires, and people were returning from the outdoor shelters to the warmth of properly heated cabins. The relief was profound, but so was the confusion and the residual fear. What had happened? Why had all fires gone out simultaneously? Why had indoor fire been impossible for more than a day, while outdoor fire functioned normally? And most troublingly, what guarantee did anyone have that it would not happen again? The community gathered later that day to discuss what they had experienced and to try to make sense of it. The theories were wild and varied, none satisfying. Some suggested that the extreme cold had somehow affected the air inside cabins, making combustion impossible. But air is air, and temperature alone does not prevent combustion. If anything, cold air should support burning better than warm air because it is denser and contains more oxygen per unit volume. Others proposed that some kind of gas or vapor had infiltrated the cabins, displacing oxygen or introducing a combustion suppressant. But there had been no smell, no visible evidence of unusual air composition, and the effect had been absolutely uniform across all cabins, regardless of their construction or location. A few people, particularly older residents with more traditional worldviews, suggested that the event was supernatural, a sign or a warning or a test delivered by forces beyond human understanding. But this explanation, while it could account for the impossibility of what had occurred, offered no insight into why it had occurred, or whether it might occur again. The most practical response, regardless of explanation, was to prepare for potential recurrence. Families stockpiled additional blankets and cold-weather clothing. They prepared materials for rapid construction of outdoor shelters if needed. They organized shifts for maintaining fires so that someone would always be awake to respond immediately if fires extinguished again. The community developed contingency plans that assumed indoor fire might fail at any time, but the second occurrence never came. Through the remainder of that winter and through subsequent winters, fires burned normally. The simultaneous extinction and the temporary prohibition against indoor combustion were not repeated. Whatever had caused the event of December 17th, 1861, did not recur, at least not in ways that were documented or remembered. The settlement along Richland Creek survived the winter, though several of the oldest residents died during or shortly after the crisis, their deaths attributed to the exposure and stress of the 30-hour period without adequate warmth. The community's cohesion was actually strengthened by the shared crisis, as people who had worked together to survive the impossible developed bonds that persisted through subsequent hardships, including the Civil War disruptions that eventually reached even this remote region. But the memory of that night and day haunted the settlement for years. People who had experienced it would sometimes wake in the night to check their fires, seized by sudden fear that the flames had died again. Parents taught children the techniques for fire starting from scratch with an urgency that went beyond normal frontier education, driven by the knowledge that continuous fire could not be absolutely relied upon. The comfortable assumption that fire, properly tended, would always burn when needed, that assumption was shattered, replaced by a wariness that never entirely faded. As years passed, and as the generation that had directly experienced the event aged and died, the story evolved from traumatic memory into community folklore. The details became less precise, the timeline more ambiguous, the impossibility less absolute in the retelling. By the 1880s, when the original witnesses were elderly or gone, the story had become one of many tales about the hardships of early settlement, notable but not particularly distinguished from other stories about difficult winters and close calls with disaster. Modern investigation of the event, to the extent that investigation is possible for something that occurred more than 160 years ago and that left no physical evidence, has found no natural explanation. Meteorological records from the period confirm that December 17 to 18, 1861, was indeed exceptionally cold in the region, with the temperatures likely reaching 15 to 20 degrees below zero, as the settlers estimated. But extreme cold alone does not cause simultaneous fire extinction, does not prevent indoor combustion while allowing outdoor fire, and does not create a temporary but absolute prohibition against sustained flame in enclosed spaces. Some researchers have suggested that the settlers misperceived what occurred, that the simultaneous extinction was coincidence rather than synchrony, that the difficulty in relighting fires was due to inadequate technique or poor materials, rather than to any genuine prohibition against indoor combustion. These explanations require assuming significant errors in observation and reporting by multiple independent witnesses, all describing the same sequence of events in consistent terms. Others have proposed that some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, an unusual temperature inversion, a temporary change in air pressure, some combination of conditions that has not been documented before or since, created an environment where indoor combustion was genuinely impossible. But atmospheric science provides no framework for understanding how such conditions could exist, could affect enclosed spaces while not affecting open air, and could resolve themselves completely within 30 hours. The supernatural explanations that some settlers offered at the time have their modern equivalent in theories about electromagnetic anomalies, about quantum effects that might temporarily alter the chemistry of combustion, about possibilities at the edges of understood physics that might, under extraordinary circumstances, produce impossible results. These theories have the advantage of not requiring that the witnesses were all mistaken, but they have the disadvantage of proposing mechanisms that are purely speculative and that cannot be tested or verified. What can be said with certainty, based on the documentary evidence that survives, is that something highly unusual occurred in that settlement on that night. Multiple families, writing independently in diaries and letters, described the same sequence: fires going out simultaneously, complete inability to relight them indoors, outdoor fires functioning normally, prohibition lasting approximately 30 hours before resolving. The consistency of these accounts, written by people who had no apparent reason to fabricate or exaggerate, suggests that they were describing events as they experienced them. Whether those events occurred as described, whether they can be explained through natural phenomena not yet understood, whether they represent something genuinely impossible that occasionally intrudes into a world that normally operates according to reliable physical laws, these questions remain open. The fires went out. For 30 hours they could not be relit indoors. Then they could. And no satisfactory explanation exists for why any of that should have been possible. The settlement along Richland Creek no longer exists. The families who lived through that cold season gradually moved away or died. The land they cleared returned to forest, and the trails that connected their homesteads faded into the landscape. Nothing marks the location where people huddled around outdoor fires in extreme cold because their cabins had become places where fire would not burn. Nothing commemorates the night when the most fundamental technology of frontier survival simply failed. But the story persists in scattered form, preserved in family histories and local folklore, in historical society archives, and in the accounts of researchers who study frontier hardship and survival. And occasionally, during particularly cold winter nights in the Ozarks, people claim to notice that their fires seem less stable than they should be, that flames flicker in ways that suggest fragility rather than robustness, that the warmth they provide feels more tentative than it should. These are probably nothing more than the normal variations in how fire burns under different conditions, the expected sensitivity of flame to drafts and to fuel quality, and to the thousand small factors that affect combustion. Or they are the psychological legacy of stories like the one from Richland Creek, stories that make people notice and worry about fire behavior in ways they otherwise would not. Or they are evidence that whatever caused the fires to fail in 1861 has not entirely disappeared, that the conditions or forces or impossibilities that manifested that night might manifest again, might be waiting in the deep cold of winter to remind us that nothing we rely upon is as permanent or reliable as we need it to be. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozarks' most literally chilling mysteries, a night when fire failed, when the technology that survival absolutely depended upon simply stopped functioning, when families huddled in extreme cold because the spaces built to shelter them had become places where flame could not exist. The cold season when every fire went out at once stands as a reminder that the basic physical laws we rely upon feel less like laws and more like patterns that usually hold, but might occasionally break, that the technologies we build our survival around can fail in ways we have no backup for, and that warmth is always temporary, always conditional, always one impossible failure away from being withdrawn entirely, leaving us exposed to cold that cares nothing for our need or our vulnerability or our absolute dependence on flame to keep the darkness and freezing at bay. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where fire died and cold ruled absolutely, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between reliable and fragile, between the fundamental and the conditional. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what you would do if fire simply stopped working, on how long you could survive if the warmth you depend on was suddenly withdrawn. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you notice the fire or heat in your space and consider how completely you depend on it. A like helps bring these narratives to more people who appreciate mysteries that remind us how thin the margin is between survival and death. When the things we rely on most prove less reliable than we need them to be. Until our next journey into territories where the impossible becomes actual and the fundamental becomes fragile, drive safely through these cold months, and remember that every fire you light is a temporary victory against a cold that is patient and permanent, that the warmth surrounding you now could fail in ways you cannot predict or prevent, and that somewhere in the Ozarks there are descendants of people who survived a night when fire simply stopped working, and they remember, even if the rest of us have forgotten, that warmth is always conditional, always temporary, and that the cold is always waiting for the moment when the flames go out and cannot be relit.